Wamanjaka Wurundjeri Narapish. Welcome to Wurundjeri Land and Country. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're having this meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who looked after it for many tens of thousands of years. Also, I'd like to offer my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and to their peoples, and to any other Aboriginal people who are visiting us today. I'm Rob Gardner, and I help to organise these meetings with Chris Moss behind the camera and Peter Wonfor, who was out the front. If you would like to help us with future meetings, we'd be delighted about that, or if you've got ideas for future meetings, we also appreciate it. You could talk to us afterwards. Tonight we've got Anne Pearson from AEMC, which we're very honoured to have. So I'm not going to talk much at all, because we want her to do most of the talking and you to ask all the questions. Firstly, I'll introduce Malti, who will talk a bit about the Australian energy market, the German Climate College, and many other things, Energy Hub. And then Donna will tell you a little bit about ATO. Thank you, Malti.
Thank you very much.
And if we stand over this side.
Thank you very much. I'm Malte Meinshausen, and I'm the director of this Australian-German Climate and Energy College. You see there the blue banner. And the co-director, I have the pleasure to be together with Frank Jotze from ANU here, the Energy Transition Hub, both initiatives together with Germany. And we could not be more delighted to have the pleasure here to co-host this event tonight with ATA. There should be 10 banners of ATA here in the front. They are the ones who put this event together. So thank you very much to you. One issue, one very nice development, as you all know, is that renewable energy technologies are coming down the cost curve. They are plummeting whatever we do. That's just happening at the moment. So the question whether we can ripe and harness these benefits in Australia to actually create a low-cost energy system in a zero-emissions future, as the Paris Agreement envisages, that largely depends on whether we get our rules and markets together so that these market forces can play at full force. No pressure there. We have tonight the extreme pleasure to hear the head body of the market and regulation, etc. And so if we get in Australia these markets and rules in the right way, then the zero emissions future in the world can be a golden one for Australia, and the energy intensive industries, the manufacturing jobs, they are then flocking again to Australia because we are so blessed with renewables as hardly any other country. So it is really the pinnacle of the solution is getting the rules and regulations right, and we are extremely looking forward to tonight's event. Thank you very much for coming, and I hand over to Donna for the introduction of the speaker.
Thanks, Malta, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight on a Wednesday night. And it's really good to see that so many people are really interested in these series events that we have been running. So I'm Donna Luckman, I'm the CEO of the Alternative Technology Association. I know there's lots of members here already, but if you don't know about us, we're a not-for-profit organisation that's all about inspiring, enabling and advocating for people to live sustainably in their homes and their communities. So we reach about 250,000 people a year with our independent expert knowledge, and that's through our Renew and Sanctuary magazines that you might see out the front. It's through our branches, this is a Melbourne branch event. We've got 14 branches around the country who run similar events as well. We also run a number of national events, one called Sustainable House Day, and also these events with local council called Speed Data Sustainability Expert. We also run a lot of research that we do into what's new and emerging in the sector and inspecting on residential. So look out, in the next couple of months, we'll be releasing a bit of a landmark report on switching to all-electric homes. This is an update on some reporting that we did about 2 years ago, but looking at the economics of switching off from gas to all-electric homes. But the other important work that we do is advocacy as well. And we've been doing lots of work over the years advocating for energy market reform and how that can help people in residential areas. And I always talk about that the first bit of advocacy work that we did at ATA over 10, 12 years ago is when people started getting solar and connecting to the grid. So there's probably people in this room who are some of those early adopters who got solar, put it on their homes, rang up their electricity retailer and said, I want to connect to the grid. And the electricity retailer didn't even know who you were or what to do with you. So one of the first advocacy work that we did was actually standardise contracts for people wanting to connect to the grid and also advocate for a fair feed-in tariff as well. So we like to think of it that the 1.8 million Australians who now have solar on their rooftops have benefited from the advocacy work that we have done today. So I'll introduce Anne, and I'm going to have to read from my notes here, Anne, and thank you so much for coming tonight as well. We know it's a very busy time for you. So Anne has been the AEMC Chief Executive since February 2016. Prior to her appointment, she served as Senior Director of Market Development, where she was responsible for directing reviews and rule determinations to facilitate the energy sector's adjustment to technological change and manage emerging concerns about energy security and consumer responses in a carbon-sensitive world. Seems like there's still a lot to do in that area. Before that, Anne's roles included Executive Manager of Retail Regulation at Energy Australia and Corporate Mergers and Acquisitions at law firms Freehills and Deacons. So would you please welcome Anne, who will give us a bit of a talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end as well. So thank you.
And yes, I used to work for an energy retailer, and we did struggle with solar panels in the early 2000s. I distinctly remember that. So can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Yes? Just, okay. I'll pretend I'm talking to my children to get them off of devices. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening, Donna. It's fantastic to be with a group of people who are so interested in energy and power. I, many years ago, lived in a country where the electricity supply was neither secure nor reliable. The country was in the middle of a fairly brutal civil war, and cutting off electricity supply was a deliberate strategy to wear people down. So for a week or two at a time, there was no electricity, not for elevators, not for televisions, not for anything. But that was in Lebanon, and it was 30 years ago. It's quite a different thing to trying to imagine what our lives today would be like without power. It's almost unfathomable, at least for those of us who live in the cities. Without energy, what would my household be like in the evenings? You know, I have a husband and 4 children. We use electricity for cooking and gas for cooking and heating. We use it for powering computers, charging up almighty smartphones and tablets that now you need to do everything from homework and also to work out what to have for dinner. And it really is necessary for what to have for dinner at our place. Having an adequate supply of power is critical. It plays a role in our society, and it underpins our economy. And in fact, secure and reliable energy supplies are one of the things that distinguish the first world from the third, and it drives our economy. That's why it's so important to have an energy sector that's resilient and one that delivers what households and businesses want now, but not just now, but also in the future. So against that backdrop, what's the role of the Australian Energy Market Commission in all of that? How do I use this? Just this way?
Correct.
Excellent. Our role at the AEMC is to make and amend energy market rules to support the evolution of Australia's energy markets. And when I say Australia's energy markets, I'm meaning essentially the east coast of Australia. We have fairly limited rulemaking in gas in relation to WA, but really when I talk about Australia, I really mean the east coast, from North Queensland, a fair bit of the Northern Territory, Tasmania, and then out to South Australia. We change the energy market design and the frameworks that support it as the world around us changes, which is essentially constantly, as you know. We also provided advice to governments, all 9 of them, to help inform their decisions in relation to energy policy. It's very important to stress right at the outset that the governance of energy market development and our regulatory frameworks in Australia that support our markets are established so that they put consumers in the driver's seat. It's consumer decisions and preferences that drive investment and innovation. And so that's a sort of fairly motherhood type statement. How is that done? In our work at the Commission, we're guided by an objective, which is to serve the long-term interests of consumers in our decision making. And the objective is there on the slide. It's very important. It's contained in the National Electricity Law, the National Gas Law, and the National Energy Retail Law, and it guides us in every decision that we make. And we're tasked to promote efficient investment in and efficient operation and use of electricity or gas or retail or energy services for the long-term interests of consumers. The key point about the objective is the wants and needs of consumers, not governments, not industry, but it's consumers that are at the centre of our decision making, and we don't have the discretion to do anything different. So how do we do this, and how do we know when our frameworks are right? The picture on the slide there explains that at a conceptual level from the consumer's perspective. The consumer is in the centre, and our job is to make sure that she has good choices available to her. That's sort of the first ring. She has the necessary information and tools to make decisions that she believes are in her interests, and then and adequate consumer protections if everything goes pear-shaped. The third ring is around having a power system that's functioning efficiently to deliver the power as and when she needs it. And then right at the outside, if the power system is not delivering, there's a set of intervention mechanisms that can be used as a last resort if all else fails. Sorry. So I said we had two functions, the rulemaking on the one hand and the advice on the other. So I'll deal with the rulemaking first. Sorry, wasn't sure whether it'd be a cold lecture theatre like the ones that I spent time in the late 80s. It was much nicer here, and there are even coloured seats, and a much nicer computer. We make changes to the regulatory frameworks so that we can continue to support consumers and to put their long-term interests first. We have a fairly unique system here in Australia where anyone, any company, any government, any advocacy, any individual person, any one of you here sitting here can put in a rule change and say we want to change the rules. The only person who can't do that is the Commission, is us. This means that if you think that there's something that's not functioning properly, if you think that efficient outcomes aren't being delivered, if there's a barrier to a particular technology or a problem with how the physical or financial market associated with electricity and power operates, then you can put in a rule change. You don't have to petition a government, you don't have to petition some other central authority, you just request a change with some supporting evidence, but you just request a change and then we have to deal with it, we have to look at it. We look, and when we get it, we look at whether it would be in the long-term interests of consumers, whether the idea that is proposed in the rule change request will be in the long-term interests of consumers. If it is, then we'll make a rule. We won't always make exactly the rule that's put forward to us, but we'll come up with another solution that achieves the same outcome. But if we don't think it's going to be in the long-term interests of consumers, then we don't make a rule. And all of this is done in accordance with open and transparent processes that are set out in the national energy laws that we need to comply with. If you're familiar with our decisions, and they're pretty long and detailed, but if you follow our stuff and if you followed it for a few years, you'll see that there's an approach and that we take. It's not it's an approach that we adopt. We don't do it blindly, as every case must be considered on its merits. But there are some approaches that you could identify. A starting point for the AEMC is that markets work best, but not always. If we don't think that they're going to work, then we'll make rules and we'll regulate. And the National Electricity Rules alone is about 3,000 pages. So, there are lots of I can give you lots of examples where we know and accept that markets don't work, and so we make rules around them to support them. We generally take the approach of allocating risk of investment to the person that's best able to manage it. We don't make rules with specific solutions in mind. Rather, we define outcomes in as neutral and objective a way as we can to allow for the best solutions to win out on the day, but also over time and as things change and as technologies improve. At any one point in time, we have 20 to 30 rule changes on the go, and I'll explain a couple of our current ones or ones that you might be interested in a little bit later. Well, as well as our rule making, we also provide advice to governments on energy market development. As I mentioned before, we have 9 governments in Australia that are interested in energy policy, and they all get involved, and they are very, very interested in it. State governments have the constitutional responsibility for energy supply, so they're the ones that can make laws about energy, how it's delivered, that sort of thing. But the Australian government also has other powers that are related and speak to the sort of traditional energy space. Most significantly, and what most of you are interested in, is that through the foreign affairs power, the Commonwealth, the Australian government has responsibility for meeting our international commitments and in particular our international commitments for emissions reductions. So that means they get involved too. And you can put constitutional responsibility aside really, because we've also got this enormous beast that's known as the national grid. It's this interconnected power system, and it actually requires all governments to work together cooperatively. Because consumers don't care about constitutional niceties. Believe me, I've tried to explain it to them. They want a secure and reliable supply of energy. They want it at the lowest possible cost, and most of them want to reduce emissions as well. And so they should. They should want all of that. They should demand that, and they should have that. And this is one of the reasons why the Commission was established, to be a central source of advice, a single agency with the technical expertise and the ability to join the dots, to bring things together, to advise governments on efficient energy market development and related policy that benefits consumers. There's also a practical element to having the AEMC, which does actually go to the constitutional point. Appointing the AEMC as the independent rulemaker, which is a somewhat unusual thing to do, because let's face it, we're a statutory authority, but we're making rules that have the force of law. That's somewhat unusual. But doing this means that it prevents a lot of delays and inconsistencies that would occur if every state and territory was required to do what we're doing, which is consider rules, undertake reviews. So there are lots of efficiencies that are gained from that. As part of our advice function, we give different types of advice. They're not all the same. We have a bunch of regular reports that we do either every year or every other year to monitor different sections of the market, and then that helps identify emerging issues and really helps set the policy agenda. An example of this is our annual price trends report, where we look at drivers for residential prices, both now and looking 3 years ahead. Why do this? What some might say. At times it doesn't always tell a really good story, but if we know what's going to drive price adjustments, it can help governments and advise governments on how they can help consumers to manage things. Each year we also look at the state of retail competition and how our approach to regulating the economic regulation of network services is going and whether they're fit for purpose. Both of these reports are very important these days because given the dynamics that are going on and resulting from new technology connecting into the system. As I said, these reports help identify trends, challenges, but also opportunities, and they help provide a broader sense of what's going on. We also provide, as well as that regular stuff, we get asked to provide one-off pieces of advice. If there's a particular issue that is concerning governments that they want us to do a deep dive in. For example, we've advised on different ways that emissions reductions can be carried out. We've done reviews on embedded networks and how they work and the consumer protections around them. And we've also, and following from that, we've got another whole work program on that. We're also in the middle of a review, probably one of the biggest work streams we've ever had, that has been going for 2 years and will probably go for a while yet, on how to keep our power system strong and operating within its technical limits as the generation mix changes. And this is a particularly exciting area from the new technology perspective, as new technology is playing a great role in providing services such as frequency control that were previously byproducts of big old generators that used to exist in the system. And these are critical services that help support our power system and keep it operating within its technical limits so we don't have major blackouts. So that's our basic role, rulemaking on the one hand, advice on the other. While we do a variety of different rules, and the reviews and advice work can cover quite diverse subject matter, the way we consider issues remains the same. We consider them through the prism of those energy objectives. That approach is consistent, rigorous and transparent. Sorry.
That's right.
Did you think it was electron microbiology? Sorry. No, I never did biology. Yeah, that approach is consistent, rigorous and transparent, as I was saying. It's always going to be clear to our stakeholders how we've assessed a problem that's put to us and the reasons for our decision. And it's something that they value, and no matter how many times we ask the question, and we ask it every few years when we talk to our stakeholders about what we do and how we do it, it's something that they repeatedly say that they value, and even if the decision that we make is one that they don't like, and or it's one that they don't, or that they would have preferred that we made another decision. So, just one more slide on governance and how we do things and process. Many of you would know that we aren't the only show in the energy town. The Commission's one of a few different energy market bodies that play their part in keeping our energy system ticking along. We all have similar names and it can be incredibly confusing. But there's no confusion about our roles. At the top of the structure, and the slide there, I've got up there, sits the COAG Energy Council. The COAG Energy Council is made up of the energy and resources ministers of each of the states and territories and the Australian government. The New Zealand Energy and Resources Minister sort of has observer status on it as well. The COAG Energy Council is responsible for the policy oversight and the broader strategic direction for our electricity and gas markets. It doesn't get into the day-to-day operation of these markets or energy market development on the whole. It leaves that job to the three market bodies. I've described us as the rulemaker in the middle, and there's also the market and system operator, AEMO, and the regulator, the Australian Energy Regulator, there on the side too. These three agencies are independent of government. That's both practical and it's also intended to provide confidence that the market will not be subject to political interference. It was one of the, when these energy governance arrangements were designed back in the early 2000s, it was one of the key drivers of this was having separation between policy and politics, if you like, because even back then investment was an issue, different kinds of investment issue, but it was still an issue. I think last year the CEO of the Australian Energy Market Operator, Audrey Zibelman, came to speak to you. She would have told you that AEMO was responsible for the day-to-day operation of the power system and the spot market, the electricity spot market, as well as various elements of the gas markets, as well as the wholesale electricity market in WA. It's pretty important. It's a pretty important job, I think. In a market that has an annual turnover of over $11 billion, it's almost really unimaginable at one level. On the other hand, the Australian Energy Regulator polices the system. They set the revenues for the monopoly infrastructure, so for the poles and wires, and for the gas pipelines. And they issue and enforce retail licensing and consumer protections, and they monitor the wholesale market to make sure that market participants are doing what they should be doing and then taking enforcement action when they don't. And if that wasn't complicated enough, the heads of each of our organisations also make up the Energy Security Board, as well as the independent chair and deputy chair of that board. And you may know, unless you've been in a cupboard and haven't been reading the press for the last few months, that the Energy Security Board is charged with implementing 49 of the 50 Finkel panel recommendations, and indeed is also tackling the 50th as well. So that's really my sort of overview of what we do and what the other bodies do. Hope that gives you a bit of an overview of what's going on. Whilst we all have distinct roles and responsibilities, we do, these three market bodies in particular, we do work together very regularly and cooperatively. It's absolutely critical that we do so, particularly in a time of transition like we're in now. So any questions on any of that before I go into a bit more about what I think or the Commission thinks the key market challenges are and some of our work program? Sure.
I'm surprised your guidelines that you showed at the start didn't include trying to address climate change or minimising emissions. It was purely price and delivery. Do you think that's a hole in it, or do you get around it by saying people want it, so we'll do it anyway?
No, it was deliberate to keep it out because it's actually been an issue for a while. We've had a few governance reviews over the years since the Commission was established, and two things come up. Whether there should be a social imperative to the objective, so whether you should take into account the social considerations, and environmental ones. And on each occasion, the COAG Energy Council has decided not to incorporate anything like that into the objective, because it's their view that those sorts of matters are more properly the domain of governments, not for a statutory body such as the AEMC. So that's the reason why. It's come up again as part of the Finkel panel review, and one of the Finkel panel recommendations was that the COAG Energy Council give to the AEMC a bit more guidance and direction on how to deal with environmental issues. So we are expecting to get something, but they have always been fairly protective of what they think are the broader policy issues. They're really big kind of value judgments that they think that's what parliaments are for, as opposed to officials like us, really. So that's why.
I was just wondering how many submissions you may get on rule changes and how many of those may be relevant and you would have acted on possibly.
Well, how many rule changes we
How many
get?
rule changes may you receive in the last 12 months, for instance?
We get about 50 or 60 a year.
Yep.
In electricity, since we've been around, we've made about 215. We've made about 40 gas rules. And they can be a rule change that's changing one line, or they can be adding whole chapters to the rules. It varies. Sometimes no one will be interested in what we've done, so we won't get any submissions on anything. Sometimes we get hundreds or thousands, particularly if there's a petition type response to some of them. So it varies. Yeah. Is there a question over here?
I want to come back as much with a comment about the first question as another question. The response leads me to believe that under the rulemaking, we're now in the position where the consumer is driving it, and that according to the energy supply pricing and a few other things that you said.
Security, reliability.
But in a way that's very selfish of the current generation, because by not including the environmental impacts of what we're doing, we're effectively stealing from future generations.
I think the test is the long-term interests of consumers, but to your point about future generations, I think what we would say is, yes, and the Commission has been saying for a number of years, governments, please, we do need to settle our policy on emissions reductions, and we need to settle it properly and have it in place, and then once it's in place, it makes it a lot easier than for bodies like the AEMC and indeed even the other jurisdictional regulators that still have a lot of roles and functions in this area to be able to make holistic decisions. I guess, yes, I understand where you're coming from. I think our solution, the solution we have, say to that question is, let's get this matter sorted, because unless we get it sorted, we will have issues.
But in a way, it was ironic that in the advice section, the environment was included.
We were asked about efficient mechanisms that integrate and work well with the energy market, because energy always seems, and rightly so, the energy sector is always seen as a way to reduce the emissions. I think there's one right at the back. Sorry, I hope I'm not getting everyone in the right order. Sorry, lady at the back.
When will these bodies set up?
When the AEMC, so us and the regulator, we were set up in about 2005 and sort of started in full swing 2006. The Australian Energy Market Operator was in 2008 or 2009. There was a predecessor, but it was just electricity. This one is gas and electricity and has a lot more functions. Green chat.
In regard to the objective and the sort of previous questions of that, I fully understand why the Energy Council wouldn't want AEMC to decide on, say, emissions levels. I still find it very surprising that you wouldn't say as your objective to construct an energy system that meets government's emissions reduction targets, where it's not even something you seem to need to take account of what they have said to do.
Well, any laws that are there, and that's always going to be effectively a constraint on our rulemaking. But it's not our job to implement government policy, and they in other areas. And so it's sort of like a constraint, but it's not something that we see our role as to implement. Neither do they.
You mentioned consumers as at the focus.
Yeah.
How do you get views from consumers, and are the consumers on the board or something?
We get consumers' views a few ways. They participate in our processes. We have a lot of individuals who like to get involved in our stuff. We deal with a number of consumer agencies and consumer representatives. We have our own Consumer Priorities Forum, which we run a few times a year, and a number of consumer groups participate in that. And as part of our retail competition review, we also survey consumers directly. And that's always been a really important thing for us to do, to understand what their views are. And that's sort of on the smaller side. It's much harder, but we are engaging a lot more with larger and industrial consumers now as well. They've been a much harder beast. They're loud, but it's actually a lot harder to get their views on specific things.
Thanks for your explanation. In your talk, you mentioned that the aim is to reduce consumer costs.
Yes.
But in your objective, it says prices. Now, I declare my interest. I have a strong interest in the demand side.
Yes.
And I can tell you, I think that's a really big difference. What can you tell us the reason why price is there?
Well, so it's not so
everyone
much
talks
price.
about
Yeah,
cost.
it's not so much price. It's about least cost in terms of efficiency.
No, but it says price.
With respect to price, yes, and when the way we interpret that as trying to, because we make decisions on a whole suite of things that affect the price that consumer pays at the end, and the end price is a function of a whole bunch of things. So the decisions that we're making along the way that affect different parts of the chain, we try to do it at least cost. That's how we interpret that. Yes.
With recognition, how do you see you will be able to handle a situation when there is a price crash? For example, we can see the progression of the price halving every 2 years. So the cost of putting in solar panel on the rooftop, wind farm, solar farm and all that is getting cheaper and cheaper.
Yes.
So would you see it one day that might be a price crash, like that's just too much power, too much green power, and nobody's making money?
Well, I think we have seen a fair bit of roller coaster pricing, certainly in the spot market over the last couple of years, and it's had huge impacts on consumer bills, which, you know, as I said, you'd have to have been to a cupboard not to have heard about that. And I think one of the things that we would say at the Commission to sort of stop that roller coaster pricing, we need that certainty on emissions reduction policy so that things can settle and that the right level of investment can take place. To your point, yeah.
Well, what the point is, would you one day need to regulate to the point that we are not allowed to put X number of kilowatt of panel on the roof because there's too many of them?
I think that covers not just pricing, that covers another area that I was going to get into, which is around managing the power system and keeping it operating within its technical limits. And one of the things that we are seeing as different forms of generation enter the market, that's a great thing, and they're filling the gap, that's wonderful, but it is changing the power system and making it harder to manage. And so one of our work streams has actually been a whole work stream on how to deal with just those issues, having too much energy in when the demand at the time when the demand's not high enough, and what do you need to do to stop the whole system from just crashing? Okay. Yes.
You're looking at me.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
There. Yeah, I'll ask you first. You can go next.
There doesn't seem to be anybody. I can't read all the stuff up there.
That's right.
But, so, who is actually looking after the physical and engineering technology without which you wouldn't have a job?
There's a few people have responsibility for that. The market and system operator, they manage the power system, so they control the high transmission network and manage the engines that bring the dispatch engine that brings the generation in. And then transmission operators and generators between them have to have all the kit on the ground. And there are a whole host of rules and regulations around what you need to bring if you're a generator and you're connecting into the transmission network. And there are a whole host of rules and regulations around what transmission networks need to provide, and because they have to meet certain standards that are set by state governments. That's at the top end of the chain. And then at the distribution level, distribution networks have to operate their networks to certain standards, and then increasingly, as consumers put on their own kit, they're having to meet all sorts of different standards, and the more sort of investment there is at the distribution level, then that's going to have to change. How things operate down there will have to change too.
The thing that was concerning me was back in 1859, I think it was, there was a very, very large coronal mass ejection from the sun. If we had one today, I just wonder whether the network would stand up and whether you'd burn out any of those very large transformers, which would be a bit embarrassing.
Oh, I think it would, and South Australia had a near-death experience in September in 2016, and that, as a result of that, that's really changed the way the market and system operator manages and deals with what they call contingencies in the rules, and what's credible and what's not. And what's credible is changing over time. And indeed, one of our rule changes actually dealt directly with that issue, and that gives them a lot more flexibility to deal with kind of out there stuff. In our case, we were thinking more about high winds and bushfires and things, but they do have a lot more tools to be able to manage those sorts of situations. Now, I think there was one question here.
Just looking at the market, and you said the market generally works, and you're looking at the consumer interests. I think we know that in the 30-minute rule settlement stuff, the market hasn't worked for the consumer, and even the Australian Capital CCC says that the market's working, so there's nothing wrong with that. It's really been exploited. Now, I understand the Commission has adopted the 5-minute
settlement, yes.
But it's 3 or 5 years till implementation. I can't quite understand why it takes that long to get that in place.
We went through a fairly rigorous process with all stakeholders, from the market and system operator down to all the participants, and we got to the timetable of 3 years and 7 months, I think it is. It's consistent, if not faster, than any other jurisdiction that we're aware of where they've aligned dispatch and settlement. Compared with New Zealand, compared with the States, I think it's not as fast as everyone would like, and I agree with you. That rule's got enormous
2 more years of gaming the system.
enormous benefits for consumers. I think in sending much more efficient price signals, but it's a beast, and it takes the implementation, and it's such a big change that the implementation needs to be done properly. You can't. Our experience of rushing these things is that there's usually a bit of a disaster if we do it too fast. Okay, 1, 2, 3, then I might continue.
Why does it take 3 years?
Because you're having to make a whole bunch of IT changes, change a whole series of algorithms and formula that underpin the rules, and also it affects the contracts or the hedge market that operates alongside of the spot market, and so you need to allow a little bit of time for transition there as well. 2 more, 1 and then you go, and then you.
Okay. Climate change authority was supposed to be autonomous, not stuffed up by politics. I think everybody here is well aware that politics did get involved and governments got involved. You said you're totally independent. Are you telling me that unlike the Climate Change Authority, the government can have no influence on what is...
We carry out our role independently. We're created under...
Climate Change Authority said
Yeah, we
that,
created... there is a difference between us and the Climate Change Authority, and the difference is this. We're created under South Australian law. We're funded by all the states and territories, and we have... but we operate through a cooperative legislative regime that operates in all the states and territories who sign up to it. So either everyone's in or everyone's out, if you like. No one's completely... You can never bind a parliament, and there's I wouldn't say that it's impossible to change these governance arrangements. But when I say we're independent now, and I think we have we're in a pretty good place. Indeed, the 3 market bodies are, because we're the AER is a creature of the Commonwealth Government. We're a creature of the states and territories. The market and system operator is a company limited by guarantee that's funded by the market participants. The risk is spread. There are different roles and responsibilities. It works pretty cooperatively. The rule-making process is very open, is very transparent. Anyone can do it. And indeed, and I was going to get to this later, but I'll cover it off now. Indeed, the governance framework really relies on the participation of everyone and a cooperative approach by everyone, because that's how change happens. And that 5-minute settlement rule, which is probably one of the biggest rules we've made in the last 5 years, came from a consumer. It wasn't government, it wasn't a COAG Energy Council, it wasn't Energy Australia, it wasn't one of the big guys. It was a consumer that put in that rule change, and that's probably the biggest change in the spot market since it was set up in the late 90s. So yeah. Last one, and then I'll continue.
Thank you so much. You have been so responsible.
That's all right.
So many questions.
That's all right. I've got 4 kids. I'm used to questions.
Since 24 years ago, and many people complain how expensive the energy cost is, electricity and gas. And occasionally I meet somebody among one of the public lecture, and say, their family have the expertise actually to use solar, and then they get even not only not paying electricity anymore, as well they can actually sell those to the company. I actually hope that sooner or later, let the public know who how many households in Australia have the capability of even selling the energy produced, and not paying the company. They make. I believe they make so much money out of us.
Well, I can't really comment on the pricing side of it and who makes money out of it and who doesn't. There are lots of clever entrepreneurs out there. But I would say we do have a rule change on at the moment to create a distributed energy resources register. So, and then that will serve would serve many purposes. One of the main drivers from the perspective of the governments is that it will give a much better lens on what's out there, so really to help manage the power system, because increasingly what goes on in distribution networks affects what happens in the transmission network. Apparently, there are all sorts of stories that when a cloud goes over the sun, consumption from the grid will just increase dramatically, and it makes it quite difficult to manage the power system, as I was saying earlier. But yeah, I think that rule change will be an interesting one. All right, I might get on to now a little bit about our work program and what we think the key challenges are. And yes, I don't need to tell you that there's a lot going on at the moment. That's why you're here. The system is transforming. There's heaps going on in energy. There's just heaps going on everywhere. I like to think about these things. What it's like today. What was it like 10 years ago? 10 years ago, our population was 20 million. Now it's 24.5 million. The first smartphone was unveiled in 2007, and now there are, 16 or 17 million of them in Australia alone. And one of the statistics that I find incredibly interesting is that in the NEM, in 2007, so 11 years ago, there were 300 generators. Now there are around 1.6 million. I think that's extraordinary, really. I think it's amazing. It cost, back then, it actually cost $10,000 or so to put solar panels on your roof. Now you can buy them just with your credit card, and you don't need a $10,000 limit to buy them either. And 10 years ago, you would never have read really an article about energy in a newspaper, and these days there has to be at least 3 or 4 in the big circulating papers. So there a lot's going on. A lot's happened in a relatively short period of time. And from all of that, we've got, I'll just talk about some of our work in sort of 4 key areas. One is around consumer empowerment and protection. The other is around system security and reliability, flavour of the year. I was going to talk about the integration of emissions reduction and energy policies. I've covered that a little bit in questions, so I'll just deal with that quickly. And then and gas market development, which is interesting in and of itself, but has become much more critical given the role that gas sort of plays in electricity these days, or doesn't, as the case may be. Let's see. I don't need to tell you either that people are sourcing and using energy differently that they did in the days of, government-owned, centrally controlled utilities like they appear on the Monopoly Board. New technologies and business models are offering consumers choices, and they're offering them the opportunity to take control if that's what they want to do. New service providers are offering consumers the ability to meet their energy needs whilst also reducing emissions, and that's something that consumers want too. For many years now, the Commission's had a fairly long work program that's been sort of geared to putting in place what we call the building blocks that allow customers to take control and to take advantage of what's out there. When we started out, customers basically got what they got. They got a black Ford and that was it. But over the years, we've made some rules around making it easier to switch retailers, understand and respond to price signals, access new technologies and get better deals to suit different lifestyles and needs, and to get more value from the energy investments that are made. And as I started this presentation with saying that transformation is being driven by consumers. Consumers want to use rooftop and storage. They are attracted to new technology, and this is a really good thing. It's how the sector's meant to evolve. And our research shows that 1 in 5 Australians already have solar panels. 21% say that they're likely to adopt storage within 2 years. 18% tell us that they are likely to take up a home energy management system over that same period. So our rules can seem pretty mundane, and if I told you the names of them, you'd fall asleep. They're things like ancillary service unbundling, cost-reflective tariff reform. They're pretty boring in and of themselves, but what they allow to be done and what to happen in the market makes them quite exciting. And we're seeing through our research that we do as part of our retail competition review, we're seeing extremely interesting and exciting offerings and products out there. If you've got a solar battery set up, you can find retailers that will use your energy and generation patterns to optimise your system in line with spot prices. If you've got a swimming pool, you can find a bundled offer that so that your pool's only cleaned when the electricity price is lowest. And if you're sort of super interested in every bit of consumption throughout the day, you can sign up with a retailer that gives you real-time usage information wherever you are, so you can turn sort of stuff on and off remotely. So with these building blocks in place and them out of the way, and with technology improving at a rate of knots, and with customers getting more involved in their energy decisions, now at the Commission we're looking ahead at options to buy and sell energy and energy services at the distribution level in a more dynamic way, and looking at what the regulatory implications for that will be. We published a report yesterday that sort of, which is on reliability, but is quite interesting. It's got a few case studies of some newer demand response type products and offerings that are out there, such as those provided by the likes of Reposit, DX and PowerShop. So we think these are quite exciting because some of these sorts of products are really enabling consumers to benefit from the investments that they make. It's allowing them to manage their electricity consumption, but also these same investments can help lower emissions, but also help manage the power system, and they can be used to sort of collectively provide services to help manage the power system. But not everyone's interested in all this stuff. Not everyone's like you. They don't want to engage in energy markets and energy consumption in this way. And so through some rule changes submitted actually by governments this time and by some individuals, we're also sharpening up consumer protections to deal with sort of current, with some current practices. So we've got some rule changes that we've either made or are about to make sort of to ban sort of misleading discounts, which is we collectively call the dodgy discounts rule change. Some rules around prompting people to shop around at the end of the benefit periods of their contracts, and looking at better and more flexible ways to deal with estimating meter reads, because inaccurate estimates can have huge impacts on consumers and their bills. As I said before, we've also got a very interesting work stream looking at embedded networks and the consumer protections that should go along with those as well. The second area of our work that I thought I would go through is reliability and security. So, whilst the previous slide was about what's going on at sort of the direct consumer level and the distribution level, this is about the transformation that's going on at the other end of the energy food chain, large generation and transmission at that end of the market. But it's also related to the other end in an interesting way, because there's a potential now for all consumers to help manage what's going on at the other end. At that end, there are two forces for change in the power system. One is older generators are retiring as they get to the end of their economic lives, and new generations such as wind and solar and other forms of capacity such as demand response are entering the system. And this has implications for both the security of the power system and the reliability of the power system. Reliability and security. These terms have very specific meanings in the law and the rules, and it's not what you would think. They sound similar, but they're very different, but they're interrelated, all at the same time. Reliability is about having enough power or capacity in the system as and when you need it to meet consumer demand. Security, on the other hand, is about everything in the system operating properly, operating within its technical limits. So frequency is in control, voltage is in control, all that sort of thing is operating in as it should. You can have a secure power system that's not reliable, but you can't have a reliable power system that's not in a secure operating state. So a power system that's secure could be one where everyone's load's shed, so that's secure. We don't want that, and so that's why I think we and the reason why I'm explaining this distinction is from the end consumer's perspective, they probably don't care, and that's fine. But it's important from the regulatory and power system operations perspective, because how you address each of them is quite different. And the tools that you need to manage them as the system changes are quite different. The reliability panel, I'm just going to introduce another small body for a second, is an industry panel. It's made up of energy industry experts, and it's chaired by a commissioner of the AEMC. We have now 4 commissioners, and one of them chairs this panel. And every year they release a report on the national electricity market's performance in terms of both reliability and security. Its latest report finds that actually we have enough power supply right now, but we have a growing and emerging problem regarding the management of the power system. So on the security side, keeping it within its technical limits. So more action needs to be taken really, and they say, and this is what we're doing, to integrate sort of weather-driven generation into the grid. So we're all right on reliability for now. That's a longer-term project and it's time to deal with that. But on the system security side, we need to act now, and we are. The starting point for regulation in this space was, our power system was really made up of large centralised synchronous generators. The technologies that are connecting to our power system now are quite different. They're smaller, they're intermittent, and they're not synchronised to the frequency or the speed of the system. And that's why it's becoming harder to manage. And the power system needs to be operated differently. So we've made rules that, and this is a bit of a slightly techie bit now, but we've made rules that require minimum levels of inertia and system strength. These are essential qualities and characteristics that a power system needs, and we used to get them as byproducts from big coal and gas generators. We don't get it once they've gone, so we have to get it another way. We're requiring new connecting generators to do no harm to the strengths of the system when they connect. We're also in the middle of a very, very big rule change that's reviewing all of the technical standards for new connecting generators. And as I mentioned before, we've got new last line of defence mechanisms for the market and system operator to avoid big disasters. And also generators are having to give the market and system operator much more information about how their generators work, their models, that sort of thing, so that the market and system operator can understand how the grid is changing. So, and in doing this, we're defining the services and the requirements of the power system in a neutral and outcomes way, so that new technologies, for example, distributed energy resources like batteries, smart appliances and other software systems, can play a greater role in keeping the system secure if that's the best way to do it. This is more and more important as there's more weather-driven generation entering the market. And so this work program that we've had has been, as I said, been on foot for 2 years. We've made about 9 rules, and I'd say there are 4 or 5 to come. The second area, as I mentioned, reliability. It's about having capacity in the system to meet consumer demand. Reliability is delivered quite differently from security. So security really is managed by the market system operator, doing stuff, procuring services, getting generators to turn on, turn off, getting transmission operators to do stuff. Reliability is done quite differently through market-based mechanisms. There are various different market structures that go to making up the reliability. They're too many and too complex to go through right now. But what we can say is that to date, our system is operating within the standards that are set for reliability in the rules. But we do have some work on foot, both rule changes and a review, to consider how our approach to reliability can be improved over time as the system changes. In fact, we published a report yesterday that looks at different ways to improve reliability. One of those ways that we explore and that we're seeking feedback on is demand response. And we're asking our stakeholders for feedback on that. We consider demand response to be an important component of energy system. and effectively utilising demand response can avoid the need for building new generation, and not consuming energy is a really great way to reduce emissions because you just avoid them altogether. In our paper, we explore what areas of the regulatory frameworks that might need to change to implement demand response that can support the reliability of the system, and we do it through a case study. And the case study shows two different options. And I'll mention this to you because it actually got a bit of press yesterday because it draws on themes from an iconic Australian movie called The Castle. And The Castle, if you've seen it, there are many themes in the film. One of them is strength and the power of individual action and how individuals can make a difference. So we use the example of the Kerrigan family of The Castle and how they could access more demand response that would help them lower their bills but also help the system more generally. And the media yesterday we were a little bit surprised that we had produced this 250-page report that contained a lot of what we thought was great energy market development and policy, and the press focused on this. But after about half an hour, I thought, no, this is good. This is a really good outcome because it's highlighting the work that we're doing. The focus on it is really good. And there's a lot more that need to be done so that the Kerrigans of this world can have more choices and can manage their energy consumption. And if that's a way to get that message out there, then I think we're okay with that. So in the end, the guys were okay. We often don't get quoted in like Sun Herald, Sun, Daily Telegraph type newspapers. So it was a big day for us yesterday. I just will deal very briefly with integrating emissions reduction and energy policy. At the moment, you'd be aware the Commission is on this Energy Security Board. It's one of the members of it. The Energy Security Board is developing the NEG, you've heard it, the guarantee, that's going to be considered by the COAG Energy Council on Friday, so I won't say much more about it here other than it would require retailers to contract with generators for a minimum level of reliability where there's a gap, and they'd also have to meet emissions produced by that electricity. And it would achieve, from our perspective and sort of from the energy side, something very important, which would, if it gets up, which would be to create certainty back in the and create investor confidence back in the system. The last area that I'd focus on just very briefly is our gas work. As I said, not just because gas reforms are important with what's going on in Queensland and maybe in the Northern Territory, but also because of increasingly the relationship between gas and electricity, that they're much closer. So over the past few years, we've made a lot of changes about how gas is bought and sold, around more access to pipeline capacity, particularly unused capacity, information and transparency in the market to help smaller players get out there and to be able to compete and to provide consumers with more and different products, and also some more, if you like, credible threats to prevent pipeline owners from charging monopoly prices. So I think I'll probably leave it there. I hope that gives you a bit of a snapshot of what keeps us busy 5 days a week and sometimes 6 at the AEMC and what we do. And just before I finish, I'll just briefly describe a bit about how we do our job and how we weigh up the costs and benefits of a change and decide whether it's in the long-term interests of consumers. Step 1 is about being clear on objectives and designing policies that deliver these directly and not in a roundabout way. The second step we take is to allow opportunities for as many technologies and business models as possible to deliver what those objectives are. This keeps costs lower and allows for innovation that we don't know about now. The third step is to have a policy that can adapt to all versions of the future, because whatever we think the future might be, it'll be wrong. And what we find is that there are lots of actions that can be taken to achieve certain outcomes, but not all of them will deliver on the objectives we're seeking, and they certainly won't all keep prices as low as possible for consumers. So working with all of our stakeholders, our role at the AEMC is to find the lowest cost combination of solutions that deliver what consumers want both now and in the future. And so thank you very much for your time.
So Anne's just talked for an hour.
Did I? Oh, gosh.
Stop. So I'll just talk for a little bit so she can grab her breath. And you're happy to take a few more questions?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So we'll do a couple more questions. So Simon, and then the guy next to you after that. Yeah.
Sorry.
Hi, Simon Holmescourt from the Energy Transition Hub.
Hi.
Thanks, Anne, for that talk. It was very illuminating. There are two energy reports that I wait for every year with just a little bit too much excitement, and one of them is your annual market performance review, which you mentioned. This year the report contained the fantastic news that once again the NEM had met, every region in the NEM had easily met the 99.998% reliability standard.
Yep.
And that this has been the case every year this decade. My other favourite report is AEMO's ESU report, the latest of which, as you'll be aware, says that we're on track to meet the reliability standard for the next 10 years from now. Despite all this great news, the media interpreted your report last month as saying the NEM is facing a reliability crisis. Were you disappointed with this interpretation by the media and with the general political narrative that our network is unreliable? Secondly, do you think there's a danger in this environment that the political response to these misplaced fears could have us gold plate yet another part of our grid?
I think generally the response to the annual market performance review and the frequency control report that was published with it was that I think we've got the message out there that it's about managing the power system differently. I think that the reliability question is a more subtle one, and I think overall what we were saying, and I think really what did get out there, is that reliability is okay for now, but there is that broader longer term reliability issue that's being managed through the NEG by the ESB, but the focus of the Commission at the moment really is on the power system security side. The AMPR highlights why that's important, and I think, as I said, the terms can be confusing, and I think what we were trying to do, and what I was trying to do certainly in the media and that I did, was to avoid even using those terms when I could. So I tried to sort of describe system security in a more general way, and to talk about it in terms of keeping the power system stable and operating within its technical limits and that sort of thing, because it is very confusing. And as I said, most people don't care, but it is important to understand in terms of what you do about them. And did you have another question? Or was there?
We're in danger of, so with that great confusion around reliability and security and the concept held by many, especially those in positions of power, that our network is unreliable, are you worried that we might gold plate the generation part of the system, build implement policies we don't need?
I think some of us are old enough to have been around in the mid-2000s when networks, the reliability standards of networks, well, certainly in New South, not so much in Victoria, but in New South Wales and Queensland, were increased very, very suddenly and without a lot of thought. And consumers felt it in increased network prices a couple of years later. And we are all very, very conscious of that, certainly at the Commission. And so in designing the mechanisms that we think might be needed to enhance and operationalise reliability, if you like, we're very conscious of that and avoiding the need for that, for that to happen, because it could have quite significant cost increases, but you won't feel it for a couple of years. But I'm happy to say it's one of the advantages of age is having been around long enough to see those sorts of things happen in the past.
Got one here, then here, then here.
Oh, sorry, you.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Sorry. Yeah, I can't.
I was wondering if you can say a few more words about the rule change for the DR register, and what it's going to be and what impact it's going to be on the market, what kind of players would interact with it and kind of carry
I
out
think
their...
all of the above. It's a rule change that we got from the COAG Energy Council. It's one from them, and they didn't provide any rule drafting with it. So the process itself that we'll be running will be a very open one, and we really do have a fairly open mind about that rule change, because I think there are various views about what it should contain and what it shouldn't. So I guess I'm not answering your question very well, but what I would urge you to do is go to the website and have a look at the issues paper. And if you think that there's other things that it should contain, then say so, because it's also being done alongside a whole heap of other data strategy work by various governments as well. And a lot of this stuff is sort of similar, I think, and it sort of intertwines.
Thanks, Anne. Can you talk a little bit about establishing embedded networks at existing residential multi-dwelling sites as opposed to embedded networks on new sites? There seem to be different, perhaps different requirements, and the establishing them on existing sites it seems to be a bit more challenging than getting them established on new sites. So, can you talk around that perhaps?
I think as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this, but to establish an embedded network in an existing site, for example, a block of apartments, you need to get, which is not an energy issue in and of itself, but all the owners in the owners corporation would have to agree to do that, and then to take on different roles compared to what they're taking on today, and would effectively then need to get exemptions from the regulator for retailer licences and network licences, which is why I think it is difficult to do with under current. But I guess that's something that probably could be factored into our next round of work on embedded networks, which will be starting in the next financial year in July.
Well, I mean, my question went to: are you planning to do anything to try and address the difficulties establishing embedded networks?
We could do that. The main issue really for us and in what the Ombudsman are seeing, so the bodies that are set up to manage disputes, is that in existing embedded networks, that consumers within those networks don't have the same consumer protections that everyone else does, and that's really what's been driving our work. But that's not to say that the other side of it could also be explored as well.
Yeah, because I mean the thing is, those networks, when they're owned by a for-profit or operated by a for-profit operator, then the concerns that your rules are aimed at addressing are relevant. But if you had an embedded network that was owned by a not-for-profit entity that existed for the benefit of that group of residents, surely a lot of those concerns would potentially go away, depending on how it was structured, and the onerous setting up rules barriers essentially wouldn't be necessary. And I think this is where I'd like to see some work done to try and make it easier, because there's a lot of appetite for embedded networks on multi-residential sites, especially when they can be combined with shared solar, which is a very, very attractive source of energy for those sites. But at the moment, there's quite an onerous barrier to getting them in place, and it doesn't need to be there if the entity that operates the network is correctly structured in a way that it commits itself to not doing things against the interests of the
I think a lot of that, though, I'm not disagreeing with you, but individual owners have to agree to do it. And even if in one person's mind it's a great setup, individuals from time to time change their minds, though, and they like choice, and that's one of the issues that
you give them that. You don't have to structure it in a way that takes their choice
potentially
away.
you could, but a lot of the ones that we're seeing at the moment and where the source of concerns coming from that's driving our work is sort of the opposite. It's new large developments.
Yeah. But the rules seem to be structured on the presumption that the entity that runs the network will not give individuals within it the option of access to the market.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not a necessary assumption, because the entity can commit by default to do so.
Well, all I can say is perhaps when the review starts, which will be starting in July, it's those sorts of comments and that feedback that we're interested in actual experiences in embedded networks. We get a lot of stuff from the Ombudsman on this, but if if there are other experiences, I think the team would be very open to it.
Well, it's not so much that those experiences exist, because
I might just make a comment, because we've been doing quite a bit of work on embedded networks. So some of the work that Anne's talking about consumer protections, because ATA actually brought that up as a funded project that we did with Energy Consumers Australia. So it was, at the moment, if your site is, if you're an embedded network, you're falling out protections of the National Consumer Code around the energy market reforms. So it's an example of some embedded network. It's actually caravan parks. So a lot of people actually caravan parks are in an embedded network, but they actually don't have any rights because they fall out of that. So a lot of the work that Anne's doing now is actually for initial work that we did identifying ISO 1. We don't want to put a whole lot of rules to slow down innovations, because we want innovations and we want that change, but we want to make sure the consumers are protected in that process. So it's getting that balance right with the rule changes as well. So not to make all these onerous rules, so we can have these innovations go about, but also make sure consumers are protected. Because what we're seeing a lot for retrofitting for apartment buildings, it's a technology cost that is actually the big barrier, because every apartment would actually have to get their meters changed to actually put in some of these different areas. So there's some startups who are doing a bit of work in the area to try and cut or get around that, so like Loom and a few others who are doing some work in the area. So we had an article on this in a Renew issue about 3 or 4 issues ago, so I can talk to you afterwards about it as well. A question, any comments?
Yes. Distributed generation and demand control combined with cost-effective tariffs, great. It will lead to a lot of innovation and all that. However, I think a disproportionate part of the cost of all that will be a burden on the most vulnerable consumers. Does the Commission have any role in that direction, or is just up to the governments to compensate?
Affordability is critical. I don't disagree with you. Our role is about keeping prices as low as possible, but there will still be affordability issues for some consumers. That concession schemes and that sort of thing is still managed by the states and territories. We have recommended, though, on multiple occasions to the governments that we review the whole concession scheme arrangements, because the ones that were put in place, they've been in place for 10 or 15 years and they're not reflective of the sort of changing nature of energy market service provision.
Yeah. What I'm thinking is less and less energy will flow from the network to consumers, which means that the cost of connection will go up.
Potentially.
And the people that don't have that credit card to put the solar or live in government housing or whatever, they will keep on paying the same connection.
They are extremely important critical issues. I agree with you, and it's something that we have raised.
We've got about 8 more minutes, so I've got about 3 more questions on this one up there.
You mentioned a couple times embedded network, basically the DNSP level. Do you see in the rulemaking perspective there is enough transparency in the distribution network level? Basically, from the industrial perspective, we see there is a monopoly, and making it worse, like when the DNSP is deciding which generator can be connected, they have their own. They propose their own generators. So basically, they are both the referee and the players at the same time. So, what's your view on the improving the transparency in that area?
I don't have a specific view and can't really comment on the specifics of that. I'm not really sure. Are you talking about connecting generators or embedded networks? I wasn't sure.
For instance, TowerCo is reviewing, say, the generator connection
yes.
Process.
Yes.
And they make their own rules. There's no transparency. Is there any particular ruling to increase that area? Yes.
They would be considering the technical limits for that connection of the new generator, considering whether or not this will mark up the grid, the physics of the grid. So the only reason they should be turning such a thing down is if they've got things like overvoltage, and you won't make any money off the solar power anyway, because the solar power would automatically disconnect when it's reading that the grid's on an
Yeah, that's all good. I'm just saying that from a public perspective, there's any transparency to.
Well, they're not that I can't recite them to you chapter and verse, but chapters 5 and 5A, if memory serves me correctly, of the electricity rules set out their connection arrangements, and they impose a number of obligations, including information ones on on network service providers. So my suggestion would be to sort of look there first, but I can't really comment on the situation. But we have made a few rules over the past few years, particularly at the transmission level, but also at the distribution level, to require more open and transparent process.
My impression is that like in the past, there's rules saying that the service provider cannot be generated at the same time.
Yes.
But now it seems like in the markets, the service provider
is the generator. I don't think. Well, I wasn't sure that was the case. As I understand it, networks can obtain system support type services from small generators. They can't own them, they can't buy them themselves, but they can effectively contract with owners of them to use those small generators, but for network support type services. They're not participating in the market.
All right, here petition to go to this side of the room. Haven't been here, so just feel like you go.
Thanks for your talk. Just got a question about the system strength and fault levels. So the recent rule changes for that inertia put the obligation on the TNSP to procure these system strength services. And my interpretation of that is it's just a pass-through to the consumer. And there are certain generator types that are connected that are contributing somewhat to these issues. And going forward, what new connection requests have to do no harm, otherwise perhaps they have to pay a deconnection cost to procure this service. Just seems like there's cost being put on the consumer, and I'm not. I mean, going forward, there is some kind of cause of pays kind of cost recovery.
Yep.
But the kind of the retrospective side is missed out.
One of the reasons why we put that obligation on the TNSPs was because that there would be more scrutiny on their expenditure through the processes with the AER. So it was they're defined as prescribed services, so then they become subject to the whole revenue determination process. And one of the main reasons why the Commission did that was so that there would be more scrutiny.
And another question is that currently the SA link output is capped at 1,300 megawatts or so. If there are sufficient synchronous generators online, it can go up to more or less the SA system capacity put in, but it's not really commercial for generators to run when there's 1,300 megawatts or more of wind. Do you see it? It's a provision. I haven't quite read the rule changes in that much detail, but they procure the minimum amount necessary for system.
At the moment, yes, inertia, yeah.
Is there then like a benefits analysis for, do we procure more to enable?
That's the next stage of work. So we needed to make some rules in place for almost straight away to deal with some but the benefits element it's a much thornier and more complex issue. So we decided to put that one off for a bit later, but it's on the list with a few other things.
Thank you.
Right, I've only got time for one more question, so we'll go over here.
Is it me?
No, sorry.
The Australian Conservation Foundation has suggested that the easiest way to reduce your emissions is buying accredited green energy, which my understanding is a project of the state governments. What portion of the energy sold in the market is matched with accredited green energy purchases?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Is there anyone in the room who has any idea?
You've got, probably need to go to the Green Power website.
Is that there are a few different accreditation schemes, aren't there?
Yeah, so I think the one you might be referring to is Green Power, which gets administered by the New South Wales government. So it's, I think it's Green Power.
And retailers.
Green Power and there's Green Power. They're two totally different things.
Accredited green power, my understanding is, it was agreed by all the state governments, it may be administered by New South Wales, and it is relating to renewable energy generation, which has been built since about 1992.
Yeah, and retailers usually, as I'm going back to putting my old retailer hat on, they usually purchase and manage that. So it'd have to be recorded through some retail sort of load.
I'd see that the amount of that, and I appreciate that some people can't afford to buy accredited green energy, but that would be a measure of how how concerned people are about reducing their emissions.
I might unfortunately have to finish it there just because it's getting a bit late and some of us might want to need to go home. But I want us all to, once again to thank Anne for being up here for an hour and a half. And we've got a bit of tradition at the ATA. We don't give a bottle of wine to our speakers. We give them these solar lanterns called the Lukey lights. Oh. And we're actually quite obsessed with them at the ATA. And if you want to purchase one, you can go to the ATA web shop and get one too. They're very handy for camping, or I actually keep it next to my back door, so when I need to go outside to get anything from my garden while cooking dinner, I can just get my Lukey lights. So
thank you.
Even though we want to take it camping when you catch up with the family
yes.
again.
They'll enjoy it, and I'll enjoy it too. Thank you very much.
That's all right. And I might
Thank
just use a castle reference since that you've been getting onto that vibe as well. It is about the vibe, and I think the vibe in this room, and I think the vibe that we're getting from the community as a whole, that we need the governments to pull together to actually work out to get a plan for a zero emissions future that looks at affordability as well. And I think that's what we're all hoping that might come out of what's going to happen in the next couple of days. And thank you for Anne for your work hoping to push in that area as well.